Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning scope. Part 1. The scope planning processes include plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope, and create WBS. The primary outputs of the plan scope management process are the scope management plan and the requirements management plan. There are two primary outputs of collect requirements. They are the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. The main output of define scope is the project scope statement. And the main output of create WBS is the scope baseline, which has three parts: the project scope statement, which came from the previous process, the work breakdown structure, and the WBS dictionary. All of these processes are part of the scope management knowledge area and the planning process group. In this lesson, we will cover each of these processes in the logical order that you would normally follow when you're planning your project. And they are as listed here, 1 through 4. First, plan scope management, then collect requirements, then define scope, and then create WBS. There are some key concepts about scope planning that we should cover first. They are that the product scope includes the features and functions that characterize a product, service, or result. But the project scope is the work performed to deliver a product, service, or result with those specified features and functions. The project scope may or may not include the product scope. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Generally, you can tell from context, but most of the time, the project scope will include both. But definitely, the planning scope includes both your product scope and your project scope. In other words, your product scope is what you're going to build, and your project scope is what you're going to do to build that product scope. And your planning scope has to include both, not only what you're going to build, but what you're going to do in order to build it. And that includes all of your project management activities as well. Planning the scope of your project starts with plan scope management. It helps to focus on, first, the outputs of each process. In this case, the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, as well as the purpose of these outputs, which, for these outputs, is how the scope, or in the case of requirements will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and validated. Focusing first on the outputs helps you to better figure out what the inputs are, what tools and techniques you can use to create those outputs. It also helps you to remember the order in which the different processes should be done. Knowing what the outputs are of plan scope management, what is it that you have that you can or should use to create these outputs? If you think about it, you know that the project charter has been created and that should be an input to this and all of the knowledge areas management plans. It provides the overall development approach, a list of key stakeholders, a high-level list of risks and overall project risk, and much more information, including the list of deliverables that are expected. Now, the PMBOK guide also lists the project management plan, specifically things like the quality management plan, the project lifecycle description, as inputs to the scope management plan. If you haven't gotten to those plans yet, then they really can't be an input. But because planning is such an iterative process, You'll do some work on scope and think you've got a good version of that ready. But then as you review quality, for example, you may find that there are some other requirements that come out of your quality requirements that affect your scope, and so you need to come back and modify your scope plan. That's why this is listed as an input to plan scope management. Notice I've added one here in italics, which is the stakeholder register. This is not listed as an input in the PMBOK guide. But don't you think it would be one of those additional inputs that could be useful, especially since the stakeholders will have specific expectations about the project and can drive how scope is managed in the project. Now we come to the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that are inputs to the plan scope management process. Enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets will be inputs to all of your planning processes, at least those that are involved in putting together your management plans. As you can see here, some of the environmental factors from your enterprise include your organization's culture, the infrastructure that you have, how personnel are administered, and the marketplace conditions. All of these can affect how you're going to manage scope. And of course, don't forget the Project Management Office, or PMO, which, along with your program or portfolio, may have specific requirements for how you manage projects and how you manage scope. Your organizational process assets may include a template for your scope management plan. It may include policies and procedures for how you put it together. And of course, your historical information about previous projects, which would be included in your lessons learned repository. The tools and techniques of plan scope management include expert judgment, meetings, and data analysis. You should consult experts within your organization and elsewhere who have special expertise in how projects and project scope should be managed, particularly those that have worked on similar projects. People that are experts in the industry or discipline or application areas that are specific to your project. Developing the scope management plan should include many different stakeholders, including your sponsor, your team members, other stakeholders, anyone who has any responsibility for how scope can or should be managed. These meetings can be workshops or interviews or any kind of meeting that helps you to gather this information and get their input. Data analysis involves mostly what is known as alternatives analysis. As you're considering how to manage the scope and requirements of your project, you may consider lots of different options, different ways to collect requirements, different ways to elaborate on the scope of the project, different ways that you could create the product, validate the scope, or control the project scope. As you consider these various alternatives that come from different stakeholders, you'll need to choose between them. And this is simply alternatives analysis. This diagram from the PMBOK guide briefly summarizes the plan scope management process. Recall two outputs, the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, both of which are related to scope. As with the other knowledge areas, it has as its input the project charter. Plus, as you iterate through and work on these plans and revisit them later, the project management plan will have some components that will be useful inputs. And as always, there are enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets to consider, including your company culture, templates that you can use for your management plans, and lessons learned in your lessons learned repositories. The tools and techniques list is relatively short. Don't forget to take advantage of the expertise of others. The data analysis, which is simply alternatives analysis, and all of the meetings that you'll have with the various stakeholders to decide how you're going to manage your scope and requirements. With your scope and requirements management plans in place, you're now ready to start collecting requirements. The main outputs of the collect requirements process are the requirements documentation, which includes all those details about the requirements, and the requirements traceability matrix, which you'll use to help trace the requirements through the life cycle of the project. Some key concepts to remember are that the requirements become the foundation of the work breakdown structure, and that cost, schedule, quality planning, and procurement are all based on these requirements. Now we're going to reverse engineer what the inputs are for collect requirements by looking at the outputs. First, the requirements documentation. Remember what's in the requirements documentation, that it includes business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements, transition and readiness requirements, project requirements such as milestones and contract obligations, and quality requirements. Now, where will you find all of these kinds of requirements? Business requirements would come from your business case and your benefits management plan and your needs assessment. Your stakeholder requirements, where is all your stakeholder information? It's in your stakeholder register. Your solution requirements, where might you find some of those? Transition requirements, product requirements, milestones, those will be in the project charter. Contract information will be information that comes from agreements that come from procurement. Quality requirements could come from your quality plans. These should give you some ideas of what the inputs are. To reverse engineer or figure out what your inputs are, also consider the output of the requirements traceability matrix. It has the requirements listed, and they're connected to other parts of the project. Some come later, such as the WBS, but others have already been defined. Project objectives, business needs, opportunities, goals. These will give you more clues about where you might find some requirements. And here we have the inputs of the collect requirements process. We've been able to reverse engineer several of these already. I've grouped them into 3 categories: those that provide specific guidance on how to collect requirements, those that can influence your process of collecting requirements, and those that provide actual requirements that you can draw upon. Your scope and requirements management plans tell you how to define and manage scope and requirements. So you'll definitely need those in the collect requirements process. Also, your stakeholder engagement plan, because that's where you define how to engage with the key stakeholders for them to participate in collecting requirements, as well as engaging with the rest of the project. Those things that can influence your project and its requirements include the assumptions log, because all of the assumptions about the product, the project, its environment, stakeholders, even the industry or the market, and the consumers and the economy can all affect your requirements. Your lessons learned register, if this is your first time through collecting requirements, then you won't necessarily have much, if anything, in the lessons learned register yet. But if this is an iterative or agile, adaptive sort of project, and that's the development lifecycle that you've chosen, then you'll be revisiting requirements frequently. And the lessons learned register will help you to see what is and is not working on the project as far as collecting requirements at each of these stages or iterations. There are also a few places you can go to find requirements that have already been identified that you can use to begin your process of collecting requirements. These include, of course, the project charter, because it has high-level requirements and the deliverables mentioned in the project charter. Also, the business case will help provide some context of the business need and options that were considered and the recommendation for the project. The stakeholder register will also include some early requirements that have been identified by the stakeholders that you've identified so far, and it will have a list of the key stakeholders that you need to consult with. In addition, there may be some agreements for you to look at. The first example is if your project is operating within the context of some existing agreements. These could be either internal agreements between departments or external agreements with other partners. The second case is that you may be revisiting this collect requirements process after you've gone through procurement and have a contract with a vendor, at which point you may need to review those agreements to make sure that you've captured all of the product and project requirements. Another one is the request for proposal. If you're a vendor bidding on a job, then that's the primary document that you'll use to gather these requirements. In addition, there are some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that can affect your collect requirements process, and we'll get to those in the next slide. As is nearly always the case, enterprise and environmental factors that can affect this process include your organization's culture, the infrastructure that you have within your organization, how personnel are administered, as well as conditions within the marketplace. Notice here I've added government regulations, and this is in italics. This is because these items that are in italics aren't specifically listed as inputs to this process in the PMBOK guide in the section of inputs. However, these are mentioned as inputs in the tools and techniques section of the collect requirements process. So I have pulled them into here since this is really where they should be, as valid and useful inputs to this process. So this first one that I've brought in is government regulations, which of course can affect your requirements and may dictate several requirements for you. Your organizational process assets, as always, include policies and procedures that may affect how you should be collecting requirements, as well as your lessons learned repository, which may contain some useful information about effective techniques for collecting requirements that have proved useful on previous projects. Again, here in italics, we have a list of a few more documents that may be useful to you that may contain requirements or influence how you collect requirements. These include the business plans, your current business processes, any business rules that have been documented or that may not be documented, but that you are aware of, current process flows, and things like standard operating procedures. In addition, you may have problem or issue logs, especially if you have a help desk that records these sorts of problems and issues and relates them, and these can be a valid, very useful source of information about requirements that are needed for this project. Marketplace conditions means that you may need to consult some marketing information, whether some of your own within your organization or from competitors that can provide you useful information about requirements that are important in the marketplace or that you may be able to do that will help you to compete in the marketplace. And that's it for part 1. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.